Welcome back, everybody. I'm Adam Lowe, and if you listened before, you know I can talk about the towpath all day.
And I'm Chris Earl. If it's an ultra, a backyard, or some ridiculous running challenge, I'm probably signing up for it.
And I'm Katie Lowe. I love all things running, but my specialties are run streaking and the beer mile.
Together, we're here to share the stories that make running such an incredible community.
From local legends to elite athletes, race directors, and everyday runners, we'll cover the highs, the lows, and everything in between.
So whether you're out for a run, driving to your next race, or just hanging out, thanks for joining us.
This is Tales on the Towpath. Let's get started.
Hey, Adam and Katie. You may remember a few weeks ago, probably 6 weeks ago at least now, back at the beginning of the summer, I had made an appointment to head down to North Carolina. And because I was really interested in getting my sweat analyzed to see what my sodium concentration was. And I talked a little bit before that about, doing my sweat rate test and how I measured, how much sweat I was losing per hour out on the hot trails. But now we have the actual results back from my sweat test, and we are very fortunate tonight to be joined by Michael Raynor from Raynor Strength and Nutrition. And he's going to walk us through sort of how that sweat testing is done, what it means, and what our listeners can do if either they want to get tested or, if they want to deal with their sweat loss and salt loss over the course of their training and races. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to chat about sweat. It's something I'm really passionate about and get really nerdy about, so I enjoy it.
Awesome, awesome. Well, hey, why don't you start off tonight by just telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and then we'll get right into the episode.
Yeah, so as they said, I'm one of the owners of Raynor Strength and Nutrition. My wife and I own the business together. So we're actually both registered dietitians. And one of the things we offer is the sweat testing. But outside of that, we also work with athletes on, their fueling and hydration plans and all those kind of things. In addition, my wife is a strength and conditioning specialist. So that's where the strength part of Raynor Strength and Nutrition comes from, is from my wife. So she also does some strength programming for athletes generally, where we've kind of carved out our niches with endurance athletes. And I think that partially comes from both of our backgrounds. So I got my start in endurance sports with cycling when I was in high school. I started racing bicycles. Around grad school, I got kind of burned out on all of the training for that and just, the monotony of that. So I picked up running at that point, which is one of the things that my wife and I bond over because she's been a lifelong runner. And so we both kind of found our way to the sports, and through our careers in nutrition have translated, the career over to, helping other athletes be able to have their best performances.
For listeners who have never heard of sweat testing, what is a sweat analysis? What are your metrics that you're measuring? How is it performed? Can you tell us a little bit or a lot about that?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. I mean, it's really kind of dived into the more complex topic of what sweat is. So when we talk about sweat testing, at least for our purposes, we're talking about measuring the concentration of sodium in your sweat. With that being said, sweat contains other electrolytes as well. So sweat is, the fluid water portion, but then we also always lose electrolytes in that sweat. So there's sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and then we lose trace amounts of phosphorus. So largely it's those five: sodium, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and chloride are the big electrolytes that we lose in sweat. The reason that we focus on sodium is because we lose sodium in by far the greatest amount, especially in comparison to our body's stores of sodium. And so if we're having a problem with hydration, it's generally going to be kind of more sodium driven versus one of the other electrolytes. Plus, in the body, water really follows sodium around. And so for driving that hydration process, we're kind of most concerned with, that balance of fluid and sodium. But those other electrolytes are important still. And certainly when we're talking about translating this to ultra endurance athletes, right? If we're talking about half marathons, you probably could get away with hydrating with, table salt and water. But as we translate that over to ultra endurance athletes and events, we really do need to make sure we're replacing those other electrolytes as well. Again, going back to why we focus on sodium, because we lose that in the largest amount compared to our body stores. And we found really good success for athletes with as long as we are replacing our electrolytes with some sort of product that contains all of the electrolytes, if we're replacing that at a rate that it replaces someone's sodium, it's replacing enough of those other electrolytes for them to not be a problem. So again, going back to, if you have an ultra endurance, like a 100-mile race, and you're just replacing with table salt, certainly we could have problems with those other electrolytes becoming low, depleted. But as long as we're replacing all of them, we're generally in like a pretty good spot. And so that's why we tend to focus on sodium individually.
Hey, Michael, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate you coming on and talking to this about this with us. As our listeners would probably be surprised, I'm going to be the first one to go off script here. So, what's the fastest way to get sodium back in the body? Should I, eat potatoes with salt on it, or should I be taking it through liquid form? You just said how important it is to get the sodium back. So, what's the fastest way to get that back into my body?
Yeah, great question. I think ultimately it a little bit depends, right? Like outside of exercise, it's a little bit less crucial that we replace it so urgently, right? Like during exercise when we're losing this at huge amounts. And again, to put this into perspective for sodium, the average person has about 65 grams of sodium in the body, and sweat losses can vary anywhere from 200 milligrams per liter of sweat all the way up to, we've tested as high as 2,600 milligrams per liter of sweat. So in someone who's losing that high of a concentration, they're also, in this particular circumstance during the summer, this athlete was losing, 2 to 3 liters of sweat an hour. So you're talking about 5 to 7.5 grams of sodium being lost every hour. And so when we look at, a pool of about 65 grams, right, like 3, 4 hours in, we're putting a major dent in that. And so, in those circumstances, getting it in as fast as possible is going to be a high priority, right? But if we're talking about, you went out for a 45-minute run and we're trying to replace those electrolytes that were lost over that 45 minutes throughout the rest of the day, then we just want to make sure we're eating a balanced diet, especially as like an endurance athlete. If you're training, you know, over 5, 6 hours a week, we probably don't need to be scared of the salt shaker, right? I think that's one of the other things I get a lot is when people come in for sweat testing is like, we're really driving home the importance of electrolytes. And there's also this messaging out there that people should be avoiding salt throughout the day. But I think that's one of those areas where, endurance athletes, especially ultra endurance athletes, your needs are very unique from the average person in the population, right? Like the recommendation of 2,000 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day does not apply to someone who's sweating for 4 hours a day.
When you do your sweat analysis, is this something that takes place like in a lab, a controlled setting, or do you do it out like a field test?
Great question. So there's a lot of different ways that you can actually do sweat testing. So one of them is like a full body rinse where you use like deionized water, rinse off of somebody with a known quantity to like wash all the sweat off of them after they've exercised. And then you analyze that, right? Like that's very difficult to do. That's very labor intensive, time intensive. There's also a lot of, areas where that can go wrong. When we look at the more feasible sweat tests, really it comes down to there's really three versions. There's exercise induced, where you put patches on somebody, they go exercise, and that's what induces the sweating. We use electrically induced sweat test. So we put a couple of electrodes on the arm. That runs for about 5 minutes, sends a really small electrical current, similar to like a TINS unit or an E-stim, something like that, just through. And then that stimulates the sweat glands to release their sweat underneath where we put the positive electrode. So it's about quarter-sized electrode, and that stimulates the sweat glands in that area to just release their sweat. And then once that's induced the sweat, we put a collection method on that. The third method is chemically induced. So there are chemicals that you can like drip on the skin, basically makes the sweat glands release their sweat. We kind of landed on electrically induced because it can be done at rest. So someone doesn't have to exercise. We don't have to have a shower facility for people coming from out of town. With exercise induced, that's obviously going to be like more of the downside is, right? Like people are having to exercise, get sweaty, then they're sitting around sweaty while you're having this consultation with them. The other downside is if someone goes out for a 45-minute run, they come back, they don't have enough sweat. Guess what? You get to go run some more. Or if they're very sweaty, those patches may fall off on the side of the road. They never realize it. And then you're putting patches on them and they're doing another run, right? So there's like a lot of margin or a lot of places for error to kind of come in with some of those forms of testing. And so that's really what kind of boiled us down to electrically induced. Plus, I mean, we partner with Precision Fueling and Hydration to perform the sweat test. It's their like standardized sweat test, their equipment. we own the equipment, but it's like the test that they developed. So, for us, that also kind of drove this path as well. And this is a very roundabout, long-winded answer. I'm circling back. But part of that for us was, having access to their database, right? All of the precision sweat testing centers in the whole world put their data into precision system, and so you have access to a ginormous pool of data that's being analyzed by them to come up with average sodium concentrations, further research on like, hey, does sodium concentration influence race performance, those kind of things. So again, there's a lot of factors that drove us to the electrically induced. With that being said, ours is done in an office, like in our office in downtown Cary, North Carolina. People just come in, they sit at the desk, we put the electrodes on, and then we collect the sweat from there and some like little tubing, and then we push it through the analyzer machine so we have answers right away. But that same kit that we have, as long as we have access to power, we can pick that up and take it somewhere else. So if someone had a training group that was out doing a trail run and wanted to offer sweat testing to everybody afterwards, then, as long as somebody had like a generator or some power source, we could certainly do it in the field. But we don't need the exercise component to induce that sweat.
Hey, well, what would you say the biggest myth is with ultra runners about sweating, salt, and then staying hydrated?
There's a lot, and I don't think it's like, runners' fault, right? I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. I think probably one of my favorites to pick on is that when it's hotter out, we need to take in more sodium. And I'm sure that probably raises more questions on like why that's a myth or misconception. But ultimately, hydration really comes down to the balance between fluid and sodium. So if we're taking in tons and tons of sodium but not enough fluid, we really can't effectively hydrate. So the way that our body regulates hydration is with the concentration of sodium in the blood. And this gets to like the bigger topic of like where we store fluid in the body. So we don't, like, if we think about body fat as energy, right? We have a massive pool of energy. Even really lean athletes, you're talking about 40,000 plus calories of energy stored as body fat at any given time. So it's a massive pool of energy. We look at carbohydrates as an energy source. We have pools, they're not massive, but you're generally talking about 90 minutes to 2 hours worth of glycogen stored in an athlete at any given time. But when it comes to fluid, it's like we don't have just an organ sitting there full of fluid waiting to be sweated out, right? We have a little bit of water in and around cells that, we start sweating out pretty quickly. And then the only place that we store water really like in a substantial amount outside of that is in the blood, is blood plasma. And so when we start exercising, we start sweating, trying to cool off. The thing I always equate this to as well is the body's always prioritizing resources, right? So it's like some of this stuff may seem counterintuitive for like long term, but the body's viewing like, hey, I might just need to, cool off, sweat, get through the next hour, and then I'll be fine. So we're always prioritizing resources for what the most urgent demand is. And so when we start exercising, that urgent demand is not overheating and dying. And so we sweat. And so when we start to deplete some of that fluid in and around cells and we need more, we pull it from the blood. We reduce blood volume by pulling that blood plasma out to have that fluid. And so some of the electrolytes come out with that. But again, remembering that sodium's a concentration in the blood. If we're taking in tons and tons of sodium, if we put that sodium into the blood to try to pull a little bit of water in, it's going to be too high a concentration. Same thing's true in reverse. If we're taking in tons and tons of water, but not enough sodium, and we try to put that water in the blood, it waters down our body's stores of sodium. And that's a very tightly regulated range. If we go out of that range, it's, if we put too much water in, it's hyponatremia, which is incredibly dangerous. And so, again, it's tightly regulated. And so I think that's probably like the biggest misconception is just, ignoring that balance between the two.
So, Michael, one of the things we talk about a lot when we're out on the trail, especially when I'm running with Adam in the summertime, is terms like being a heavy sweater or a salty sweater. Maybe you come back and when you dry off, you've got all those white lines of salt, or maybe you're leaving footprints on the towpath because you're sweating so much through your shoes. What can you tell us about, is there a difference between being a salty sweater and a heavy sweater? And based on that, how drastically different is that from person to person?
Great question. Yeah, this is like one of those pieces that varies drastically. So yes, there's a difference between heavy sweaters. There's a difference between salty sweaters. Somebody could be both heavy and salty, but you can be salty and not heavy. You can be heavy and not salty. So like the way I think of this is like everybody think back to like high school biology or whatever, but like a Punnett square from genetics. And so along like one axis, we've got like low sweat rate and then high sweat rate. And then on the other axis, you've got a spectrum from like low salt concentration up to high salt concentration. So someone can fall really anywhere on that spectrum. They can be really salty, but not lose a lot of sweat, or they can, like I said, be really salty and a really heavy sweater. So generally, like that term, like the way that we kind of differentiate that is a salty sweater would be somebody that's losing lots and lots of salt in their sweat. They may also lose a lot of sweat, right? But they're losing a lot of salt, like that concentration is pretty high. And then a heavy sweater, the differentiation there would be that that's someone who loses a lot of sweat in general. And so again, if that concentration's high, then they may also be a salty sweater. But if that concentration's low, they may just be a heavy sweater, be losing a lot of volume. Both of these vary. Some people are just genetically heavier sweaters. Some people are genetically less heavy sweaters. Everybody varies some, right? Like, everybody can think about how much they sweat when it's 30 degrees outside versus when it's 90 degrees outside. So everybody has like a spectrum of like sweat rate, basically. But when it comes to the salt concentration in our sweat, that's fairly fixed. And that's largely genetically determined as well. So again, somebody who's a low salt sweater is a low salt sweater. Someone who's a high salt sweater is going to stay a high salt sweater. So like I said, genetics is really the largest determinant here. Diet can play a small effect, but we're generally talking about, single percentage points. So it's pretty small. It can change a little bit over time, but again, that effect over time is pretty small. And so that's one of the things that we think is so cool about the sweat testing is, you come down, get the sweat test done, and those results are applicable for a long time. So you can think of that as like a fixed constant. But in terms of like how much, because I think that that's like, kind of the next like question with this is like, okay, that can vary, but like what kind of range are we talking about, right? So I think a good example, I just recently had somebody in that even when it's 85 degrees outside was only losing about 12 to 16 ounces of sweat an hour. So not a lot, right? On the high end, recently we had someone that was losing like 85 to 90, 95 ounces of sweat an hour, which is an obscene volume when you like try to put it into like scope of like, a liter jug or something like that. Like that's just a crazy number. And then I kind of already talked about like the sodium variance, right? Like on the low end, someone might only lose like 200 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat. But on the high end, that can exceed 2,000 milligrams. You're talking about over a tenfold difference in sodium concentration between people.
So, hey, Adam, didn't you say you did a little bit of a sweat rate test tonight?
Yeah, I did. So I am famous for like when we're about to have a guest on, I will like do whatever they are coming on to talk about. So like
Nice.
we had a strength guy, PT guy come on. So I lifted weights for 2 days before he came on. So today I weighed myself before and after my 8-mile run, which was about an hour and 1 minute or something. But I
Okay.
lost 6 pounds during the run. So like I Googled it or whatever and figured it was about 96 ounces of sweat. And then Chris put that in the liters for me. I don't know. But anyway, that like I am known as a heavy sweater.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, you're looking at like right at almost 3 liters with that number. I mean, those are substantial losses. And so, you know, again, with the the salt concentration variance, right? You could be a low concentration, but that's a relative number. And I think this brings up a really good point that when we talk about sodium concentration, it's milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat, or you can turn it into per 32 ounces of sweat or 30. You can change it to whatever that number you want to be is, but it's relative. It's tied to that concentrate or to the volume. So as that volume goes up, our absolute losses of sodium go up. So even if you're, at those volume losses, even if you were average, and average is right around 1,000, it's like 990 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat. So let's call it 1,000 for easy math. If you're losing 3 liters, you're now losing 3,000 milligrams of sodium every hour. So even though your concentration is not that high, not an astounding number in and of itself, because of your volume losses, it drags that number up and becomes substantial losses.
yeah, I don't know. Like, so is it better to like lose? Okay, I'm a competitive guy here, right? So like you just talked about like sodium loss or heavy sweater. Like, is it better to be one or the other? Or am I thinking about this wrong? Like,
Yeah,
is
well, you
it
don't
a
have control over it. So.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
better
I,
is probably not the question, but
yeah, I mean, I'd say certainly like some of these combinations of, sweat rate and sweat concentration present unique challenges. Like even low concentration, low volume losses present a challenge in finding sports drinks that they're that low of a concentration, right? Like you really get down to basic Gatorade and Powerade being appropriate for someone whose losses are very, very low, which like that's not necessarily bad, but like there's very few certainly ultra endurance races serving, Gatorade on course, right? It's always scratch or tailwind, which are going to potentially be twice or triple someone, on the low end of things losses. And so, there's never going to be anything on course that's appropriate for them. Same thing on the opposite end, right? If you're a really high concentration sweater, there's nothing on any course that's going to be anywhere close to appropriate for you. So you have to be self-sufficient. So again, I think there are certain challenges, and I think in the run sheet you guys have kind of like something you wanted to touch on a little bit later, so I don't want to spoil it. But I think this will come back up later with our ability to stay hydrated when our rate is that high. That's a difficult challenge.
yeah. So in the running community, we all consistently are trying to find ways to hydrate and fuel that agree with our gut and the absorption and things that will not cause emergency restroom trips or accidents, right? So we all know what I'm talking about. So it is very common for runners to experience nausea or stomach shutdown in races, especially late in races, or if you're lucky, maybe after the race. So how does that electrolyte imbalance or improper fluid concentration directly affect our gut and absorption of the carbohydrates?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite questions, and it really gets into just how important hydration can be or is. So, again, going back to what I said about, the body prioritizing resources, when we talk about, exercise and the GI tract, during, pretty intense exercise, blood flow to the gut, to the intestines and everything can reduce by as much as 80%. So we're talking about a massive, massive reduction in blood flow to the GI tract. We're not going to be able to efficiently, absorb stuff or digest things if, our blood flow is reduced by that much. And so that's a unique challenge in and of itself. If we're running a half marathon, that's an hour and a half. If we're really pretty quick, it's 2 hours, 2.5 hours, right? That's a manageable amount of time for us to have reduced blood flow. You start talking about ultra endurance races, 8 hours, 10 hours, 24 hours, 30 hours, where we have that much of a reduction in blood flow to the gut. That's really difficult. I mean, some people tolerate that okay. Other people, I mean, that's a massive stressor. And, especially when we factor in, again, running's a unique challenge, even over ultra endurance like cycling or, I mean, Ironman triathlon, you're still looking at some of the same factors because you wind up with a run. But running in and of itself, there's a lot of jostling and bouncing around. And like the intestines are not like fixed in place, they kind of like bounce around. And so there's also like a level of like shear forces where the intestines rub against themselves, create hot spots that can kind of create GI distress for some people. And so I think this is where like the hydration becomes like extra crucial, because if in a hydrated state, we see an 80% reduction in blood flow to the gut, and we already talked about that a huge component of blood is water. If we get dehydrated and that blood volume is reduced, we're talking about a further reduction in blood flow to the gut. So you're basically starving the gut. You're not able to process stuff. Stuff sits there longer. We're a lot more likely to have GI issues. So the whole point of like that answer is that hydration plays a huge role in helping preserve that ability of the gut to function. But with that being said, there's a lot of, especially for ultra endurance running, there's a lot of stressors and difficult factors weighing into that. So even if we get the hydration, great, we may still have GI issues, but our goal is to minimize that as a risk factor.
Just to dig into that a little bit more. So if, like you mentioned earlier, that, someone might only need Gatorade or, a simple hydration drink, if they're getting tailwind, with that electrolyte balance being more than they need, is that more or less likely to add to the GI problem, or not really connected?
Probably not really connected to the GI issue unless we're like volume wise doing too much or too high a concentration of carbohydrates to where you're making that absorption difficult. Generally, though, you can see issues either direction, right? Like whether we're doing excessive fluid, like we talked about, like really for ultra endurance stuff, our concern with a massive discrepancy between the amount of sodium we need and the amount of fluid we need is hyponatremia. Hyponatremia, that's our concern, like long term. But when we talk about excessive sodium intake, we can still have issues there. So our kidneys are again constantly filtering everything that we're drinking to try to assess that hydration status in the body, right? And like maintain that. And so again, thinking about the sodium concentration in the blood, if we're taking in tons and tons of sodium, but not enough fluid to maintain the correct concentration in the blood, we still absorb that sodium, but it doesn't go into the blood to pull hydration in, or it's not enough to make up for how dehydrated we're getting, but we send that to, peripheral tissues. So generally, like the symptoms we look for if someone's doing an excessive sodium concentration, this is like outside of the sweat test, right? So this gets to how can we kind of figure out if we need to dial it in with a sweat test a little bit. But we'll get like swelling of the hands is a pretty big symptom because again, that excessive sodium intake goes to peripheral tissues, hands and feet, and in the body, water follows sodium. So if sodium's going to those tissues, some water's going to go there. So we get that swelling. You'll also usually see like a thirst for just plain water, just like excessive thirst for plain water. Like I don't want sports drink. All I want is plain water. And then on the flip side, if we're taking in excessive fluid, but not enough sodium, kind of the early symptoms of that we'll see is excessive urination. And so that's where the kidneys can just filter out water as pee. And so if we don't have enough sodium to really effectively hydrate with that, we try to pass it off as pee. But one of the difficult things about that and where hyponatremia plays in is during exercise and to help maintain that hydration as we get dehydrated, our body releases a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, which helps retain, water. And so eventually that, nozzle, that outlet for the excessive water kind of gets shut off as we get more and more dehydrated. And so then it becomes a vicious cycle where it's like we're getting more dehydrated, so we're drinking more and more plain water, and then it's not really effectively hydrating us, which is how we can lead to hyponatremia. Because if the kidneys could just continue functioning, then the more water we drink, the more we'd pee. And, the only thing you deal with is just like peeing your pants every 4 seconds.
So yesterday, I went on a 7-mile tempo run and my hands were a little swollen afterwards. Does that mean I had too much? And I only took water with me, so I was not drinking electrolytes as we went. I carried water with me. Does that mean I just had an excess of sodium already, like from what I ate the night before, or I needed just to drink more water, plain water, as I was running maybe? I'm just curious about that
Wait,
because yeah.
I can answer this question. You definitely had too much salt from the night before's dinner. I'm sure of that. So,
Hey,
yeah,
my recent blood work has told me that I'm allowed to freely salt my food.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say like largely it could be a lot of things. Probably the most likely is that it was like excessive sodium the night before because we do retain that for a while, right? Like think about your exact example. If you go out to a salty dinner, right? You go out to eat and have a very salty meal, we're a little bit puffy and bloated the next day. Same consideration, same thing there. A little bit of swelling is normal. I think one of the things to think about is, the body is like a giant radiator. That is, when we talk about sweat, I think that's an important thing to remember with all of this is that the primary function of sweat for the body is to cool off. The whole idea is that we push this fluid with sodium out to the surface of the skin, it evaporates, carries heat with it. But for that to really function, it just sweat alone doesn't do that, right? We have to get the heat there near the surface of the skin where it can actually be transferred to the fluid to evaporate and be carried away. And so one of the ways that we do that is by increasing blood flow to, the skin, a lot of like the peripheral tissues, just to increase that surface area. So this very much goes back to like the radiator in a car, right? Like you have all of that surface area to spread out the coolant so that it can dissipate that heat before it flows back through the engine. The body's the same way. So we're looking to increase surface area. Part of that is we get some level of cooling by just dissipating that heat across a bigger surface area. Because if it only stayed where the heat was being generated, like for running, for example, it'd be around your core and your legs. Everything else would be cold. And so part of it's just increasing that blood flow everywhere to kind of spread that surface area out, increase, just the contact with air to hopefully help cool off. But then by having that increased blood flow to the surface, as the sweat goes past, it's able to actually pick up that heat and evaporate and carry that heat with it. And so sometimes some people are more sensitive to this than others. but that increased blood flow everywhere can sometimes lead to, a little bit of swelling in the extremities, or, it sounds like your run was like a little bit shorter in the grand scheme of things, but, a little bit of swelling at the end of a 100-mile race is, probably a little bit to be expected. That's part of that is also, and one of the symptoms when we talk about like swelling shins, our feet swell too, but that's a terrible symptom to look for running because your feet are going to swell anyways. And so, that's why we stick to, looking at like hands because they shouldn't swell quite as much. But, at the long end of really long efforts, sometimes we also get a level of difficult blood return because everything's just like tired of pumping blood. And so that blood kind of pools a little bit. So some swellings, kind of to be expected at the end of these like really long events.
So, Michael, one of the things I really enjoyed talking with you about when I was down for my visit was the effect of dehydration on performance. Could you talk a little bit about how dehydration affects our race or our strength throughout the day?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's really like two kind of directions I like to go with this topic, right? One of them is that day's performance, right? But then I think the other is how this affects fitness as a whole, the training cycle, those kind of things. So I'll start with like that day's performance. So when we talk about dehydration, generally like with research and things like that, the easiest way for us to talk about it is as a percentage of your starting body weight. So when we go back to like Adam, the pre-post weight test that you did, you weighed yourself before you work out, then you weigh yourself after. Whatever that amount of weight that we've lost, we look at that as a percentage of the starting body weight as like a measure or proxy for dehydration. So we start to see performance declines at 2% body weight loss. That's, people kind of argue that number a little bit, but that's like pretty well pointed to in literature. So by 2%, we're starting to hit dehydration. You're potentially like, if we're not intervening at all with fluids and stuff like that, you're starting to see increased thirst. We already start to see a little bit of a reduction in mental clarity. Body temperature starts to go up again by 2%. We're already starting to talk about cutting into the blood supply and the reduction in physical performance. As that percentage of dehydration, that percent of body weight loss goes up, those performance declines get greater and greater. By a 3 to 5% body weight loss, you're talking about major reductions in the blood volume, measurable reductions in muscle strength, muscle power, or high intensity endurance. So really performance suffers drastically when we get dehydrated. And this is, multifaceted, right? Like when we're running out of fluid, part of the muscle firing action is a result of fluid and electrolytes being present, right? Like those are necessary parts of muscle firing. Water's like the transport medium, and then sodium and potassium around those cells form an electrochemical gradient that creates the action potential that actually allows that muscle to fire. Calcium and magnesium are involved in this process as well, right? So we have 4 of our 5 electrolytes that are lost in sweat, all involved just in the muscle firing. So when those concentrations get off, that affects the electrochemical gradient. When we don't have enough fluid, that affects the ability for this whole process to occur. And so, that aspect kind of makes sense, right? If we're losing all these things that are necessary for muscles to fire, it's going to impair the ability for these muscles to fire and relax properly. When we look at this from a cooling perspective, right? Again, blood flow is crucial for the cooling process. Sweating is important for this cooling process. As we get more and more dehydrated, we're reducing the amount of blood that we have to do all of these things to keep us cool. So then we get into this vicious cycle of we're getting hotter and hotter, our body's sweating harder and harder, trying to cool us off. And, we just get trapped there. And so it's really, as we get that reduction in blood volume, again, if we have less blood to circulate around, oxygen still needs to get to cells at the same rate. Glucose needs to get to cells at the same rate. Waste needs to go away from cells at the same rate. When we have less blood to do that, the heart has to beat faster. And so this is where, thinking about this as perceived exertion, basically, right? If your 100-mile goal pace usually has you at a heart rate of like 140 and we start getting dehydrated, all of a sudden that same pacing puts us at, 150, 160 heart rate, right? So everything feels harder than it should for that same intensity, which means we got to throttle back and we just have to go slower to stay at that same intensity. And so there's a huge effect on, that day's performance, right? When we're talking about ultra marathons, because it's so many hours of exercise, there's a huge effect in maintaining performance as a result of hydration. But where I think this is really cool, I think all of it's cool, but where I think it's like extra cool and extra beneficial is implementing this over a training cycle as well. Because if we're getting super dehydrated on a workout, that's a lot of like work for our body to have to do to recover from that. the analogy I always use is like we're digging a hole with a workout, right? And if we're not taking fluids, we're not taking carbs, we're not taking electrolytes on these runs, we're digging that hole with a backhoe. It is a monumental task to try to fill this in before the next day to be recovered. If we're taking fluid, we're taking electrolytes, we're placing that at an appropriate concentration, taking carbs, then all of a sudden we're digging that hole with a shovel or, a garden trowel. It's a much more manageable task for us to fill that in before the next day. And so recovery time is shortened, which means we can actually get more out of those workouts. We're more prepared for the next one, which means we can actually push harder in that next workout instead of just always trying to like dig ourselves out of this hole that's slowly getting bigger and bigger. So I think, huge benefits for single day, but even bigger benefits for, the consistent implementation of this, and it compounds over, a training cycle.
Yeah, I would just say that was probably one of the best pieces of advice I took away from our session, because this summer I have really been concentrating on ensuring I've got hydration with me, even on a 5 or 6 mile run. When I go out, if it's really hot, I'm carrying that soft flask with me, and it has just made a huge difference in how I feel throughout the week. My recovery before the next run has felt great. My legs don't hurt anywhere near as much as they did last summer. So I really appreciate that advice. And for our listeners, I'll just foot stomp that it does work.
Yeah. And I mean, I think too, one of the other aspects of like implementing this consistently in training, and where one of the other benefits of that is, if we're talking about really heavy sweat rates and heavy or like high carb intake goals, like a lot of athletes are now, that takes training for the body to be able to do that, right? Like you can't just like pop off and drink 40 ounces of fluid in an hour, right? And that I'll circle back around to that because I think that's an important part that plays into this hydration component. But you can't just pop off and drink obscene amounts of fluid per hour, right? We have to work up to that. We have to train our gut to do that. Those adaptations that we make to be able to do that can be lost. So once we work up to that, if we're not consistently implementing it, those adaptations go away. The same thing with running, right? You don't work up to your, peak mileage and then just quit running for 4 months leading up to a race because, oh, I already did it once, so I've got it. It's not going away, right? The gut's an athletic organ as well. These adaptations that we make can go away if we're not maintaining them. And so the other benefit here is, we're reducing recovery time by implementing, kind of more aggressive hydration strategies, aggressive fueling strategies, but it allows us to tolerate more on race day. It, improves our recovery, improves performance. So I think there's huge benefits to be had for taking the hydration and fueling around training as seriously as we take it around races.
I really like what I'm hearing because I think what you said to me was that when it got hard today at like mile 6.5, it wasn't because I sucked at running. It was because I was dehydrated. So like it should be an easy fix, right? But like the problem is I don't like to carry anything with me while running. And Chris can attest to that. And I don't think the water pumps on the towpath have like sodium and potassium in them or anything like that. So
We don't
Probably a
know
lot of
about
iron.
that. Yeah.
yeah. But
Yes.
so yeah, I definitely I think need to do I've actually been doing better, Chris, I believe, with carrying stuff on the run this summer.
Absolutely. I mean, that the run group has been actually kind of teasing you a little bit about it, because last summer you would never ever even think about carrying a flask with you. And
Honestly, I was just gonna say that's what I was gonna say. Like improving upon nothing doesn't take very much. So, Adam, I hope
Well,
you're taking notes because I was thinking, oh my gosh, he is speaking to Adam right now. I hope he's listening.
so Michael, in the past, my idea of hydrating during a run is like making it the 4 miles to the next pump on the towpath, or I just run around the neighborhood until I see a house for sale that like no cars have been at, and then I would just stop and drink out of the house's faucet. Like I have probably been caught on every ring cam in our neighborhood. Oh, the church, there's a church faucet like a mile and a half from our house is perfect.
Not their
Yeah.
indoor faucets, like the outdoor, the spigot is what he's saying.
Oh
Okay.
yeah. Oh yeah,
I
I
thought he
don't
was just
go.
going to every open house and like,
Okay, not that bad. Not that. All right,
yeah. I mean, that may work for some people. I think that's where it really comes down to like, your individual circumstances. And I think your circumstances do not permit that because of the rate that you're sweating at. And so I think this really pulls us around to like, okay, how do we go about hydrating, right? Because we talked about like why it's important, how much people can lose, the detriments of losing that much, blah, 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 blah. But then like, okay, how do we go about replacing it? Because, you know, for one, we're not looking for a one-to-one replacement, right? You're not looking to drink everything that you're losing. A little bit of weight loss, a little bit of that, loss of fluid is good and normal during exercise. But again, knowing that that performance decline starts at around 2%, we're looking to minimize weight loss during activity to less than 2%. I'd go so far as to say that even over an ultra endurance event like a 100 miler, I would love to see that weight stay close. The complicating factor there over that long of a period is that we get breakdown of glycogen stores, which affect the weight. We get breakdown of body fat stores over that long of a race, which affect the weight. So we can't necessarily look at just a 2% weight loss, but I'd go so far as to say that we're generally looking for that weight loss over that long of an event to be a small percentage, not much more than 2 in an ideal world. With that being said, that's a tall task for you, especially Adam, with your sweat rate, because okay, going back to the 2%, we're generally looking to replace 50 to 80% of what we're losing to maintain a 2% weight loss. For you, that's not a reasonable number. We can't drink that much fluid during activity. So again, going back to activity, reduced blood flow, reduced ability to tolerate, fluids and food and everything. We can't just drink obscene amounts of fluid. You can't drink 80 ounces of fluid an hour. About the max gastric emptying rate during exercise. So that's the fastest that fluids leave the stomach, go to the intestines to be absorbed and processed, is about 40 ounces an hour. So we're talking about in the middle of summer, when you're at your peak sweat rates, your absolute best case scenario, probably only replacing about 40 to 45% of what you're sweating out. That's a tall task as it is, because 40 ounces while you're running is already a lot of fluid to try to drink. I'd say generally for most runners, we kind of stop around about 1 liter an hour, which is about 34 ounces. Most of that's driven by logistics, right? If we think about most running bottles, soft flasks are usually around 500 milliliters. If you carry a vest with a bladder, it's usually 1 liter, liter and a half, 2 liters, something like that. Everything's an iteration of 1 liter. So if we try to drink 40 ounces and we're carrying 3 liters, that's ugly math on trying to figure out how long that fluid's going to last us. Let's just scale back to 1 liter an hour and, be able to figure out how long fluids last us. But that's where the other side of this comes in. So for extreme circumstances, people that have really, really high sweat rates, people that have really, really salty sweat, or that combination of both, we probably need to implement cooling strategies. And so this goes back to sweating is the body's primary means of cooling off. So for people who have those really, really high sweat rates where we can't replace 50, 60, 70, 80% of those sweat losses, we need to help the body cool off so that it doesn't need to sweat so much. And by doing that, hopefully we bring that sweat rate down to a place where, if you're replacing 1 liter an hour, maybe we are getting to 60 or 70% replacement if we can, really cool off enough. And so that's where like products like ice bandanas have gotten really, really popular. You've seen like the Omius headbands working their way around. But, just dumping cold fluids on yourself, drinking cold fluids, holding cold things can help, wearing lighter colors, just stuffing ice anywhere that you can put ice, those kind of things.
So, yeah, Michael, so when we have an athlete's sweat analysis results, like Chris went in and got his results done. So walk us through how you build that race hydration. Like, I guess basically, like, what did you tell Chris? How did you tell him, this is what you needed to do, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So the takeaway from the sweat test is whatever that concentration is, that's the concentration our drinks should be from now on to maintain that correct concentration of what we're taking in to be able to actually effectively rehydrate us. Because again, think about it, makes sense. If we're losing, 900 milligrams of sodium for every liter of sweat, if we're taking it in at that rate, then we're at least replacing 900 milligrams of sodium and the correct liter of fluid for that to be able to go into the blood and, hydrate and go around the body and stuff. So that's the big takeaway from the sweat test. That's the concentration all of our drinks need to be. So then how do we translate that to what that, drink should be? And, I keep saying drink, but this goes back to, your initial question, Adam, about like, how should I go about getting the electrolytes in, right? I have some people that are like dead set. I just want to drink plain water because I can go through any aid station, get plain water. I can collect creek water if I want to. And so then we have to find other ways to get those electrolytes, which is probably going to be like salt pills or something like that. The other option is, the benefit to a sports drink is that we're getting some carbs, we're getting electrolytes, and we're also getting that fluid. So we're taking care of, our three most urgent needs during exercise, at least at some level. We may need additional carbs on top of that, but we're at least handling those things and getting some fuel in. The reason I also like that mixture is because thinking about ultras, especially as we get late into the race, we're not feeling good. If we're at least getting our fluid in, we're getting a little bit of fuel in. Whereas if we're only drinking plain water and we're just like, oh, I don't feel like eating anything, but let me drink a little bit because I want to stay hydrated, and you're drinking plain water, one, we're not hydrating super effectively. And two, we're getting no fuel in the process. So it's like a ticking time bomb on when, your body's going to give out anyways. And so that's where I really like a sports drink that has, again, carbs and electrolytes with that fluid. And so when I'm formatting that plan, I obviously pull in, people's preferences, right? Like if they have a product preference, like I've had people that are like, Tailwind sits good on my stomach, I only want to use Tailwind. We may have to add, a bunch of things to that to get the sodium concentration where we need it for that person. Or maybe it's a great fit. So really what I'm looking for is, athletes' preferences, number one. Number two, I'm really looking to format that drink to meet their hydration needs. And then we figure out carbs, because carbs are very easy to add in. Gels, chews, gummies, food. That's such an easy piece to add onto the pile. If we pick your drink trying to get carbs and then we figure out electrolytes, that can be a huge undertaking. Because again, most drinks on the market are formulated around that average sodium concentration of like 900 to 1,000 milligrams. If we look at Scratch, for example, about 2.5 scoops of Scratch puts you right at that average sodium concentration for a liter. If you look at Tailwind, 3 scoops of Tailwind puts you right around that. 930 is what 3 scoops of Tailwind would put you for sodium for a liter of fluid. So most of these drinks are formulated somewhere around that. Some drinks are lower, some drinks are higher just based on like their emphasis. But, again, if we need extra carbs, once we hit that, pretty easy to add in versus, having to come up with 1,500 milligrams of sodium after the fact because we formatted that whole thing off of your carbs. That answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm digesting everything. And I'm going to have to re-listen to this podcast and take more notes than I've already been taking.
Chris probably knows, like, I always feel bad almost at the end of sweat tests because like a lot of this is like very similar spiel to what I give there. And I'm so passionate about it. And I end up getting so excited and I talk really fast. It ends up being really rapid fire. And probably like 8 out of 10 sweat tests, I can see people's eyes glazing over by like the last like 5 or 10 minutes. And like, I feel a little bit bad afterwards, but then at the same time, it's like, I really want to put all the information out there. Like I want people to know this, but sometimes I do feel bad that it's like crammed into such a short period that it kind of can feel like you're drinking from a water hose.
Oh, absolutely. I was sitting here thinking, okay, I'm going to need to re-listen to the podcast. Thank goodness it's on recording.
Yeah, now it lives on.
Have a lot of questions, so I may need to make my own appointment so I can get all this explained to me a second time. So if I
Yeah.
ask these stupid questions, it's mainly because I don't understand what the answer was, and I'm going to need somebody to actually re-explain it. But as we've been talking about this, I've thought about how humid it's been, and when we ran at the beach, it just felt so much harder, and so that led me to think, like, do these things that we measure, the sweat composition or the sweat rate, does that change with humidity or does it improve as we acclimate to the heat? Like my Garmin will tell me I'm 93% acclimated or whatever the case may be, but does that affect my sweat in
I
that
love
case?
this. Yes, absolutely it does. So this is like kind of a multi-part question. The first part I'll tackle is like heat and humidity, basically. So thinking about anything that makes us more hot or impairs the ability for us to cool is going to drive sweat rate up. So I think we often fixate on temperature, right? The hotter it is, the more we're going to sweat. And I think sometimes people can neglect humidity, especially like generally in like the southeast, because it's just humid. And so we don't really like worry about it because it's just always going to be humid. But humidity plays a huge role in this too, because thinking about, part of that primary mechanism for sweat cooling is the actual sweat evaporating off the body, carrying heat with it. When it's super humid, there's very little capacity for the air to take that water on. So sweat doesn't evaporate readily. And so, when we're sweating, it's not actually cooling us off. The body's like, oh, it must not be working. Let me sweat harder. Or we're just getting hotter. And so the body works harder to sweat more to try to like push that heat out. And so humidity can play a huge role in this as well, where high humidity can really keep that sweat from being super effective. And so again, we like effectively are hotter, and so we sweat more. And so humidity definitely plays a huge role in this. Generally, what I recommend for people is if you get the sweat test done or not, right? Like at least know your sweat rate. That's like a fairly easy, accessible at home thing. Weigh yourself before the workout, after the workout. That protocol is spelled out so many places. It's on Precision's website. You can find it with a quick Google search of like sweat rate test. At least kind of know that. And I usually recommend doing that quarterly, like kind of seasonally as the seasons change, to at least have that ballpark of like, hey, when it's 40 degrees outside, here's what my sweat rate's doing. When it's 20 degrees in the middle of winter, here's what my sweat rate's doing. When it's 60 degrees outside in the spring, what's my sweat rate doing? And then when it's 85 degrees in the summer, let me see what my sweat rate's doing. But you can repeat that test kind of as much as you want to really get into the minutia. And I have had people come in for sweat tests and then create, a spreadsheet where they are collecting sweat rate data from, mixtures of temperatures and humidities and starting to track it so that, when they check the weather and it's 60 degrees and 75% humidity, they can almost exactly predict what their sweat rate is going to be, right? So you can get as in the weeds with this as you want, but I think generally at least kind of understanding, seasonally what your sweat rate's going to do so that we can adjust our hydration plan based on that. So the second part of this is like regarding heat acclimation, right? And like other factors that can affect this, right? So heat, humidity obviously affect this. So this goes back to Adam, one of your first questions is common misconceptions. This is probably actually one of my favorite common misconceptions. A lot of people think that once we adapt to the heat, we're going to tolerate heat better and sweat less. That's actually not what we see happen. We actually sweat more. That sweat rate goes up. We can see sweat concentration come down a little bit. So we get a little bit more efficient. So this goes back to genetic variation in sweat composition. So this is one of my absolute favorite fun facts about sweat. Everybody's sweat is the same concentration when it enters the sweat duct. Adam, yours, Katie, yours, Chris, yours, mine. It's all the same concentration when it enters the sweat duct, which is the concentration of sodium in the blood. It's around 3,600 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat. Where this all varies from person to person and genetics plays a huge role is we have sodium resorption channels in the sweat duct. Because think about it, if we were losing 3,600 milligrams for every liter of sweat that we lose, we'd all be depleted of sodium in a very short period of time. And so it's in our best interest to reabsorb some of that sodium. And so what can vary from person to person is how many of those channels we have and then how efficient those channels are. The efficiency piece changes with like endurance training, but that's not like, 15 weeks out from your 100-miler to 2 weeks out from your 100-miler. This is like from the time you started running to now. That change happens pretty quickly at the beginning. That's like a big adaptation that happens early. And then, we don't really get a lot better at reabsorbing sodium after that. And then the genetics piece is the number of those resorption channels. And so we can improve the efficiency a little bit, but we're kind of fixed with the number of channels we have. And so somebody whose sweat sodium concentration is very, very low likely has a lot of those channels and a high ability to reabsorb that sodium. Someone whose sodium concentration is very, very high probably doesn't have a lot of those channels, and those channels may not be efficient. But even if you get more efficient, if we only have 4 sodium resorption channels, our capacity to reabsorb that sodium is low, so we're going to lose a lot of sodium. And so that's where the heat acclimation comes in. So when we get adapted to the heat, what is actually happening is our body's better recognizing when we start to get hot, and it intervenes kind of like more drastically quicker. And that's where the high sweat rate piece comes in. So basically, when we're not used to exercising in the heat, say, it's your first hot day, we go outside, we run, the body's like threshold for where we start sweating is kind of a little bit delayed. Temperature is like on the rise, it's on the run, and we start sweating to try to get it under control. But it's one of those things where, once it's out of control, it's really hard to get it back under control. And so that's kind of how we can think of heat adaptation training is like the body's recognizing that temperature is rising. It's like, oh, this is going to get pretty out of control if we don't intervene. Let's intervene. And so we start sweating heavier more quickly. And so we lose more fluid. We can get a little bit more efficient at reabsorbing sodium. So we may see that sodium concentration come down a little bit. From our experience, that's generally a pretty small change. It's the sweat rate piece that we see change pretty drastically.
So, Michael, one of the things we talked about was something I was not very familiar with before I came to visit you, and that's this idea of doing either a prehydration or a hyperhydration before a race or an ultra. Can you tell us a little bit about that and kind of what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah. So I'm generally a fan of this, especially for ultra endurance events. Really anything kind of over like 2.5 hours, especially when it's hot and humid, this can be a beneficial strategy. Or if we're talking about really long durations, even if it's not that hot, especially if you have like a higher sweat rate. So this isn't something you need to do before like a 45-minute run or a 60-minute run. But as we get to those longer activities, this can be a beneficial strategy. So the concept here is a little bit like a carb load. So when we carb load, we eat really, really high carb for 3 days leading up to an event, and it allows us to store a little bit more glycogen than we normally could. It's called glycogen supercompensation. So, it allows us to store 110% of our glycogen stores for a short period. The prehydration or hyperhydration protocol is a little bit of the same concept, but our kidneys, again, filtering all of the fluids we drink, function on a much shorter time scale than that. So this isn't like days leading up to the event. This is like an hour and a half before the event. We consume reasonable dose of fluid with a high dose of sodium. It allows us to pull a little bit of extra blood and sodium or water and sodium into the blood to kind of give us a little bit of extra buffer. It boosts blood volume temporarily. And so again, this is generally something that we kind of save for just those biggest, longest activities because it flushes out pretty quickly. So if we're not like needing that extra buffer or we're not sweating really aggressively, it's just like a very unnecessary thing. It's a high sodium load for all of that. But when we talk about that, it's generally we're aiming for about 16 to 20 ounces of fluid and 1,500 to 1,800 milligrams of sodium. So it's a very high concentration. But we're doing this over like the 90 minutes before. You'll sometimes see like Precision, I think, calls for like, they call it prehydration and they call for like the night before and the morning of. I would say generally the thought probably behind the night before is just making sure that you're hydrated headed to bed, that you're not like depleted on electrolytes headed into that. I would say generally we recommend skipping that one and just making sure we're hydrated throughout your carb load, making sure that you're hydrating on all your workouts, and then we're not really in that deficit the night before where we would need that extra like large dose of electrolytes to kind of replenish that. And then we just save the hyperhydration for that 90 minutes before the start of the race or the really long training run or whatever. And again, it just allows us to temporarily boost blood volume. The way I think of it is giving us a little bit of extra sweat buffer, basically. So Adam, for you, especially being such a high sweat rate for, runs over 3 hours, that could be like a potentially really beneficial strategy for you.
Well, hey, that kind of leads into my next question here. So I was going to ask you like a little scenario. So let's say you're on mile 60 of a 100-mile race or something, and it's hot and humid that day, and you can see the sweat, the white lines on your shirt and stuff, and your stomach isn't feeling great. Can you give us a little bit about like maybe what went wrong or, and then like, how do I fix that? I got 40 miles to go. How do I bounce back and feel better and finish this thing up?
Yeah, great question. I would say, in terms of like what went wrong, a lot of things. I mean, if your stomach's feeling a little upset too, again, this is like where the uncharted territory of ultras, right? Like that's a tough spot in the race where it's like your stomach could just hurt because it's been active for a lot of hours and have reduced blood flow. But in terms of like, thinking about it from the hydration perspective and troubleshooting that, you know, could be just depending on what you were consuming. If it wasn't enough fluid, enough electrolytes, then maybe, this is where we take a break and kind of get back on top of that hydration as best as we can. Once we're in, a multi-percentage point body weight loss, that's a hard hole to dig out of in the middle of an event, right? Like we're thinking 60 miles into this race. If you've lost 5-6% of your body weight, that takes time to claw back, right? Like we're not going to just chug a gallon of water with a ton of salt in it and miraculously be back to zero. That's like a slower process. But we have periodically recommended a hyperhydration bottle mid-race for some athletes, but I hesitate to recommend that for someone where I don't know their sweat concentration of sodium. Because if you're around average, you probably don't need that mid-race as long as we're doing everything else right. But again, if you're like a really salty sweater, high volume, that may be just enough to kind of help us, get a little boost of fluid back in the middle and kind of get us like a leg up on trying to claw our way out of that hole. But once the stomach upset starts, I generally my priority is making sure we're still hydrating. And that's again where I like getting carbs in with that. So if we can prioritize like the sports drink, I think this is where having a variety of like flavors at your disposal or different products that meet your needs so that, if you're just sick of DeWalter Melon Tailwind. Not sure if, I can say that. You can cut it out if you don't want product names. But Tailwind, if you're hearing this, sponsor the podcast. Um, but if you're just like sick of that flavor, having a different flavor to go to or a different product mixture to mix it up, or that's also one of those circumstances where I'll plug certain products out there, like Precision's products, for example, don't have a flavor. They're just like lightly sweet. And so for a lot of people, that's like a really good thing to kind of lean into when we're getting flavor fatigue, because it doesn't have a flavor. It's just, again, lightly sweet. So using things like that can be really beneficial when stomach's kind of like on the verge. But part of this, thinking about like ultras, like performance in ultras is partially like an eating slash drinking contest, like hydrating contest, right? This is so long that the more you eat, the better you're going to do. And so sometimes at that point in the race, if things are already starting to go like a little bit sideways, take an extra 5 minutes at an aid station with your crew to sit down, get some fluids in, get some food in. I think that can be really hard if the day's starting to go sideways, right? It's like the inclination is to say, all right, I'm already not feeling good. I've had to walk more than I wanted. I can't spend much time here. I got to get back out there to minimize my downtime. But sometimes that 5 minutes can be what kind of turns things around for us and helps get that second wind to just like get that fluid in, get that fuel in, get back on top of that.
What's interesting about what you just said is I know Chris and I both talked to Samir about his backyard ultra that he just did, last week or whatever. But he said at one point his stomach was real messed up and he couldn't keep anything down. And then he just like chugged like, I don't know, 12, 14 ounces of water. And then it kind of like opened up his stomach and he could, eat and drink again. So it's
Yeah.
just, I guess he was probably dehydrated a little bit or, just kind of needed some balance there. But yeah, it's just something, he's just trying anything to fix that problem. And then magically it happens. So I
Yeah.
don't
Well, I
know.
think this is like also a really hard area where it's like, ultras are so long compared to, most other things, right? Like there's, even when we talk about like the marathon distance, there's a more limited body of like research being done there because it's not super accessible, right? It takes hours and hours of time, look at people's training schedules, all of that kind of stuff. But when we talk about ultra endurance events, there's also, right, like looking at this from like a researcher's point of view, trying to come up with funds for this is like a very niche sport. And I think when we're in and around this sport, it feels like it's very, very common, but it's still like such a small like subset of endurance sports. And so it's just going to take a lot of time for us to get more research on like, especially those late event things. Cause, you'll see research about like, they just collect surveys on like what people did during the race or like what they were planning to do during the race and then their like race outcome, because those are easy things to do. And so, my point with all of this is that sometimes we just don't know. Like there's not a lot of research, there's not a lot of science about what happens 20 hours into working out, right? There's like so few people that you can actually research for that too, that it's such a hard thing to do. And so there's, even if we execute the science really well, like sometimes things go sideways. And that's like, I think one of the beautiful things about ultras is that there's so much unpredictability. You kind of have to go with the flow a little bit. But I think, for me as like someone who like wants to be able to point to recommendations and say, do this and it'll turn out okay. Like that's like also a very difficult thing about ultras because, you could execute hydrating and fueling great and you still end up with diarrhea because, that day the jostling and shear forces on your gut were just too much and your body said, no thanks, let me just dump all of this. But I think that's where, when we know your sweat rate, when we know the sodium concentration, when we have like specific fueling goals, we can limit some of those risks. And that's ultimately our goal, is to just, cover our bases as much as we can to set ourselves up for as much success as possible. And then we just have to deal with the unknowns and the uncertainty. And, and that's the thing with this too, is like, you may execute this in one race and everything goes great. And so you're like, yes, I have found the perfect recipe. And you do the exact same thing the next time and it does not go the same way.
Well, Michael, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on here tonight and sharing, an hour plus of your time with us. This has been just, for me, a fascinating conversation. And even though, like you said, I heard some of this before, like I picked up new things tonight, and I'm sure when I listen back to it during editing, I'm going to pick up on something else. And so I just really appreciate you sharing that with us and giving us a lot to think about. I have a feeling that we may be in touch and asking you some other questions here in the
Yeah.
future. So thanks again for coming on tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love this. I get so excited about sweat and hydration and fueling. It's just such an exciting thing for me because I've seen personally firsthand with athletes just how much of a difference this can make for people. Like sometimes this is the final door that we're looking behind to unlock our performance. And so it's really cool how big of a difference it can make, like I said, throughout a training cycle on race day. And so I just get super passionate and excited about it. So I'm always happy to talk about it. So thanks for giving me an outlet.
Yeah, yeah. And so, hey, for our listeners, if they want to learn more about the sweat analysis or maybe even book an appointment with you, why don't you tell them where they can go to do all that?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, Raynor, Raynor, strengthandnutrition.com. All of our info about, our nutrition services, the sweat testing, all of that is there with links to be able to go book it. You can also find us through Precision Fuel and Hydration's website with their sweat test center finder, like find a sweat test center. If you look, we're the only sweat testing site in North Carolina, so we should be easy to find. We're just right in central North Carolina. So you can find us either of those places. You can also find us on Instagram at Raynor Strength and Nutrition. But yeah, reach out to us through the website if you're interested in the sweat testing. If you have questions about the sweat testing to decide if it's right for you, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Adam, Katie, anything to close us
Yeah,
with?
I was gonna say, Katie, we're gonna have to make a trip because if Michael likes sweat as much as he says he does, I have some sweat for him. I'm not like it is ridiculous. Like I go for like a 5 mile run and I come back and I can wring my socks out and like it's just disgusting. Like I don't know, but I'm a heavy sweater and
Yeah.
I've learned a lot, right? I let's see if I put it into practice or not. But that's
Yeah.
usually that's the hardest part for me, but like yeah, it really does make a big difference. I noticed this summer even when I'm drinking, hydrating during a run compared to when I'm not.
Yeah, well, I think, the biggest thing for you is again, you're losing so much volume that that's a good place to start. And I always tell people with this too, because, a lot of people, with us being the only sweat testing center in North Carolina, we pull from a large area. There's no testing center to the best of my knowledge in like South Carolina either. So people come up from South Carolina, across all of North Carolina. We have people come down from Virginia, West Virginia, the Maryland, DC area. So we get a pretty big pull, but that's quite a trip for some people. And so a lot of people are like, man, is there like anything I can do to try first? And so my recommendation is always like just start with like what average sodium concentration is. So again, about 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter, and that's a place to start. If we're still having issues, maybe, Adam, knowing your sweat rate is so high, maybe we need to like really double down on the cooling strategies to help bring that sweat rate down. But, if we're cramping or if we're having GI issues still, or those kind of things, maybe we up the sodium. Or if you're at 1,000 milligrams getting, puffy fingers and stuff, maybe we scale back on the sodium. So you can always start there and kind of like try to fine tune. But that's where I think the sweat testing is really, really cool is it cuts out all the guesswork. We know what that concentration is. We can plan off of that. And then for mile 60 of the race, it gives us a lot of confidence in that plan as well. So I think you can start there. And then if you're still having issues, make the trip on down.
Well, we like North Carolina. We've been there. I've already been there twice this summer, so it won't be a
Nice.
bit. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it, Michael.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's all for today's episode of Tales on the Towpath. Thanks for joining us on another run down memory lane and along the C&O. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to follow, share it with a friend, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep your pace steady and your stories flowing.